we're going to be talking about sampling methods. So previously, we've talked a lot about biased sampling methods and the different kinds of problems that those have. And now we're going to talk about unbiased sampling methods, sort of the good guys. These methods are all called probability sampling methods. So as you could sort of tell, the biased sampling methods, like convenience sampling and judgment sampling, those are called non-probability sampling methods. All right, so bias sampling, or non-probability sampling methods. So those kinds of sampling methods are ones we've already talked about, sampling from volunteers, convenience sampling, and also judgment sampling. These kinds of sampling methods, the method itself isn't that great. So you might end up with a representative sample, but the problem is the method isn't that great. And so because of that, there's always the suspicion of bias. In unbiased sampling, or probability sampling, the idea is that the sampling method itself is robust and trustworthy. It's not a guarantee that you'll end up with a representative sample, but the method is unbiased. So because of that, we're more likely to trust this kind of sample than one of these kinds of sampling methods. So the basic principle behind all unbiased sampling is the idea of trusting in randomness, right? Because we're going to be using randomness, this means that, look, humans are biased. We don't know what kind of biases we're going to introduce, so we're not going to be using judgment. We're not going to be just using convenience, whatever's around us, and we're not just going to sample from volunteers. We are going to sample randomly, and that doesn't mean randomly as in like I don't know what's going on, like do, right? But we are going to sample in a probabilistic way, such that we get this uniformly random sample. All right. So there are 5 different kinds of probability sampling methods that you should know about. The first one is this. Pretend these are all different kinds of people, or lakes, or animals, or items, or pills, or whatever, ice cream, pints, right, that are in our population. In a simple random sample, what you would do is get a directory or a list of every person in the population. Start with population. Then by using random numbers, so number every person off, and then by picking random numbers, you're going to pick a subset of that population. So you would number everybody, 1 through 1,000, and then pick random numbers, either from a random number generator or something, and end up with a random sample. Ta-da! And so this is a pretty difficult kind of sampling method because you have to list the entire population first, right? So this is often only used in a limited number of cases. The next is stratified random sampling. And this is actually a little bit closer to judgment sampling. It's sort of like a mix of judgment sampling and probability sampling. And simple random sampling. First, what you do is you divide your population into meaningful strata, into meaningful groupings that are somehow important to your study. So if size is important, then you might separate by size first. If gender is important, if ethnicity is important, if cost is important, whatever it is, you stratify, you create stratas first, groupings first, and then, once you've created these groupings, then you use simple random. So then you list everyone in this little strata. You use random numbers in order to pick a subset, right? And then you do that for this strata. And you also do it for this strata. Ta-da! So in that way, you get, you make sure to have a little bit of each strata in your sample. Cluster sampling is a way of picking clusters first, and then you take everybody in there as your sample. So one common place that this is used is often in things like sampling from schools. Sampling from schools is often easier than sampling students, right? So it's easier to list all of the elementary schools in your district than to list all of the elementary school students in your district, right? So you might list all of the elementary schools and then use simple random sampling to sample one of these clusters or two of these clusters or however many you want, right? And then you take everybody in that cluster. And so maybe you'll study these two elementary schools and study everybody in them, right? Another kind of cluster sampling is called two-stage sampling. Two-stage sampling is first doing cluster sampling, and then next, once you have the cluster, then you do simple random sampling. So you start with cluster sampling. You pick the clusters randomly. Then, once you have the clusters, you use simple random, where you list everybody in your cluster, and then you use random numbers in order to pick people in that sample. So we might pick just those individuals, not everybody in that cluster. So that's the difference between cluster sampling and two-stage sampling. Cluster sampling only picks the cluster and then you're done. Here, you pick the cluster. Once you have the cluster, then you do simple random. Finally, we have something called systematic sampling. So here, this might be used at a factory. They might choose every kth item to be kth, k being some variable, every kth item to be picked for sampling. So let's say at Ben & Jerry's ice cream factory, they pick every 230th pint that comes off the factory line to be picked for quality control, right? So they might count off 1, 2. So for this example, maybe I'll pick just 10, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So they'll pick that one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. They'll pick that one, right? So they'll systematically go through and pick every 10th pint or 200th pint or 1,000th pint. So that would be systematic sampling. All right. So let's go on to examples. So example 1, a pharmaceutical company sampled their drug to see whether the potency of the pills matched the potency claimed on the bottle. Every 20th box off the factory line was pulled out, and 3 bottles were picked randomly, and then 10 pills were sampled at random. Which types of sampling was this? All right, so first there is systematic sampling. Right? And that's taking every 20th box. So K equals 20 here. So every 20th box off the factory line was pulled out, and then 3 bottles were picked randomly. So that's cluster, right? Cluster. But then 10 pills were sampled randomly from those bottles, right? So that's two-stage. So that would be both cluster plus simple random. right? And by sampling the 10 pills randomly, we don't just mean that they just, shook out 10 on their hand and be like, wow, just pick them, right? Like picking them out of a hat, right? Instead, they would have to take those, however many pills are in that box, get random numbers, take out 10, right? So, and that's how they need to choose 10 in order to do simple random. All right, example 2. Suppose you wanted to estimate the average number of capital letters per printed line in order to sample the readability of a book. Describe how to take a 2-stage sample from this book. Well, first, we need to figure out what the clusters are. You could have clusters be chapters. You could have clusters be lines or paragraphs or sentences, right? So you would have to decide what the clusters are. And then you would have to pick the samples in order to, and then you would have to pick another subset of those clusters in order to do simple random, right? So maybe, in 2-stage, first we need to do cluster, and so maybe I'll pick pages. Right? So pages will be my cluster. And so what I'll do is I'll have all the numbers of the pages and then generate, 10 random numbers and then pick those 10 pages, right? So first I pick the pages. Then I use simple random in order to pick which lines I'm going to count the capital letters of. So then pick lines, right? And then I'll count capital letters in those lines and get an average. And then I could look at averages, standard deviations, all kinds of stuff once I have that data. Example 3. The American Pet Lovers Association has a directory of 10,000 members. You want to send out a survey to 1,000 people randomly. How would you go about doing this? Well, in this case, we have a directory, so we could use just the simple random if we wanted to, right? I don't know if you wanted to do it. Maybe we want to have strata sampling to separate people into even numbers of dog lovers and cat lovers and bird lovers and whatever else. But one way you could just start off is just doing simple random. You would take all 10,000 of those members, number them all, generate 1,000 random numbers, and send surveys out to those 1,000 people. Example 4. To see how well U.S. third graders do on an arithmetic test, you might choose a simple random sample of children enrolled in the 3rd grade and give them a math test. Describe how to change this into a cluster sample plan. Why might cluster sample be a more practical plan? So, generating a list of all the children enrolled in 3rd grade in the United States might be pretty hard. It might be easier, albeit not easy, to maybe make a list of 3rd grade of districts first, and then out of sampling those districts, then we might want to sample schools, and then sample 3rd graders, right? Or if we just wanted to do a one-step cluster sample plan, maybe we'll make a list of all elementary schools. Then we'll give all of those those elementary schools a number, and then randomly generate however many schools we need to participate. And then out of those schools, we will ask all of the 3rd graders at those schools, please take this exam. And so cluster sample might be a more practical plan because it is slightly easier to get a list of all the elementary schools than it is to get a list of all the 3rd graders.